All right, everybody, this is Luke with LukeHumphreyRunning.com, and we're back at it for another podcast episode. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about really just understanding is in particular for the marathon. And I'm going to go over a case study with an athlete who just signed up for coaching with us, and some of the things that she put in her training profile that made me think that we should probably discuss this. Plus, I've seen other things too in the Facebook group. Where actually I think I just saw one this morning where somebody was saying, they basically missed their goal, and they ran Indy, and this year Indy was pretty windy, a little bit warm and stuff, so a lot of people kind of fell off goal pace. And then maybe I should try to get under, I think it was 140 and a half, and then I started doing the math on it, like, yeah, there's, you definitely need to bring that half down if you want to consider running basically twice that in the marathon. So I do want to talk about along those lines what that would look like. So along those lines what that would look like. So let's just jump right in. So, like I said, we had an athlete sign up for coaching, and then we have them complete a training profile. It's several questions long, and then we do any follow-up after that, and then put their training plan together, and then we go from there. But questions that we ask is, what are some of your training weaknesses? And it's really just, some of it's to point out the obvious, right? What do you actually know you need to work on? But some of it's just to get some thoughts flowing. And see what the person says, so that we can kind of come back to them, usually with more questions, right? Or just some thoughts on it, and that's where we go. So it's really to establish, a starting point for the conversation about what those perceived weaknesses are, because what they perceive as a weakness might be the symptom of what the actual weakness is, or it might just not even really be the weakness, but something else is the contributing factor. It might just not even really be the weakness, but something else is the contributing factor to that. So in this case, she mentioned that her weakness was she needed more speed work. But when I looked at what her other personal bests were, I didn't come to the same conclusion on that. So, and by that I mean I looked at her PR, her 10K PR, and her half marathon best, and then I put them all into a race equivalency chart, and each one suggested that she could run between 4:37 and 4:45 in the marathon, and I think she'd run, it was well over 5 hours, like 5:15 or something like that. And she just felt bring that 5-hour marathon time down. But the reality is that all her other time suggested that she can run well under 5 hours. So the speed itself isn't the problem, right? So she's fast enough to run what it takes to run a sub-5 marathon. What the real reason is somewhere at that point. And that is where our conversation has to start. Like, okay, well, this isn't really the case. Let's look at the other factors and see what is going on. And so I just want to be clear too. Like, I'm not picking on her at all, because it's a pretty logical conclusion to meet my time. I need to be faster. But and I see it a lot, right? I see it in the Facebook group a lot, where people are same thing, right? So they want to run 3:30 in the marathon, but they haven't run under 145 and a half, but they've continually tried to go up to this 345, and we've talked about this at length. Before too. Like, that's the importance of doing different segments, and on and on and on. So I don't really want to go into that, but it's just the case of really recognizing what's actually going on. And in her defense too, honestly, I think when really was in reference to structured work, because when we really dove down and looked at what she was doing, it was just really going out for runs, and then biking a couple times a week. And so there was no real training plan. It seemed like there was just running, right? And so it's a big difference. I had this conversation with my daughter. Somebody was asking me if I was still training and stuff, and I'm like, I run. And she's like, but you run every day. I'm like, well, but that's the difference. I run every day, but running every day and training are two different things, right? You can be have done good general fitness by just going out and exercising, but does that mean you're ready to run, a certain time in the marathon? And that's the two different scenarios there. And so going back to her, I think it's fair because you look at her training history. If she would have added structured work, it would probably would have done amazing things for her. She probably would have had no problem getting under 5 hours. But the moral of the story is that fast enough first. And this is where your own racing history in combination with the use of a race equivalency chart can come in really handy. So I'll use myself as an example here. So my fastest marathon was 2:14:38, I believe. If I plug that into 2:14:38, I believe. If I plug that into a calculator and I kind of reverse it, then that would say that 2:14 would be worth a 1:04:10 and a half, a 29:08 in the 10K, and a 5K in 14 flat. So using that as the baseline, I compared that to what I've actually run in those distances. So I've run 1:03:52 in the half, 29:02 in the 10K, and then 14:10 in the 5K. And so pretty close, right? That's pretty close to what the equivalency chart suggested I could run and across the board, right? So I pretty much ran what I was in shape to do. Based on my half PR, maybe I could have eked out a 2:13 marathon, but at that point, you're literally talking about 1 to 2 seconds a mile. So in the grand scheme of things, you're pretty much there at the top end, right? You're pretty much there at the top end, right? And I ran that 1:03:52 in February of 2011, and then I turned around and ran my marathon PR in June the same year. So basically that 1:03:52 ended my winter segment because I ran that at New Orleans, Rock and Roll New Orleans, and I think that was in early February. Took my downtime and then started training for Rock and Roll San Diego in June, which is where I ran the 2:14:38. So the second part of that is that as the race distance decreases, the further I got away from what I was expected to run, right? So if you look at that, I should have been able to run 1:04:10 and a half. I ran a little bit faster, so I actually overperformed in that. 29:08 in the 10K, I ran 29:02. I mean, you're talking about a second a mile within that, so I would say that's pretty good. Then you're not going to get much better than that. And then 14, pretty good. Then you're not going to get much better than that. And then 14 to 14:10, which 10 seconds off it's a little bit more, but still, I mean, I bet, I think if you go down from there, it would say you could probably run like a 3:58 or 3:59 mile, and there was no way I was going to run a 3:58 or 3:59 mile. So further away I got from what it actually, algorithm versus actuality, further got away. But the importance of that is just knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are as a racer. And that's why it's good to keep data and notes on that data, right? So that you can go back and use that. And then as you are setting up those goals, then you have not only the algorithm data, but you also have your real world experience, and then you can kind of blend that and know more or less where you're gonna fall. So then going back to my history, I was pretty much maxed out. For me to really take another step forward, I would have had to improve on my shorter distances. And so when I ran my half in full PR, I must have been right around 30, 31. And so could I have improved? Absolutely. In the shorter distances than it would have been to improve in the marathon. But what you can do is you still go back and you touch on those segments, and then you at least get back to where you're feeling comfortable running more faster paces. And then when you come back to the marathon, it's actually more comfortable. You're more used to that. Back to the marathon, it's actually more comfortable. You're more used to that. And you might not actually run those times that you need to, but you've done the work that suggests that you can now go ahead and move forward in the longer distances. So like I said, I didn't need to necessarily improve my 5K and 10K race times, but I definitely needed to go back, at least get back to and maybe tolerate some workouts that would be in line with those faster workouts, and then maybe use that speed work to run a faster half. Bring that half down to say, maybe bring it down to like 1:03:30, And then you're talking about, okay, now you can talk about running, 2:13:30 or something like that in the marathon, right? So it's not necessarily the race times you're looking for, but the longer races to be able to come down, right? And so like for a marathon, it's entirely crucial that 5K and 10K comes down. Well, the faster you get, no, more or less not, because it's going to be harder and harder. But as long as you can go back and do that work, then you come back and you say you run a, you're used to doing work. Then you come back and you say you run a, you're used to doing, 5K work at, say you're, well, let me rephrase that. So say your half marathon pace is 6 minutes a mile, and you've never really done work beyond that for a long time, right? You've always done half, specifically a half, but now it means you're touching a lot of speed work in the, the 5:15 range for mile. That's a big difference, so that when you come back, that 6 minute pace isn't going to feel as bad. So maybe you push that down to 5:50, 5:55s, but then you go back up to the marathon. All of a sudden, that marathon pace feels much more tolerable. All right. So going back to our young lady and her quest to break 5, we already established that she was fast enough to run under 5 hours. So we have to consider what else is the issue. And to me, there's two big issues that need to be looked at. And the first is you have to look at your training throughout the months and years previously, which we've really touched on already through this discussion. I'd really like to take a look at consistency over longer periods of time. Many recreational athletes tend to train for a specific race once a year, or maybe a couple times a year. And I use off relatively, right? They might still run, but not as serious as they are when they're in that training mode. And I'm not knocking this at all, but when it comes to improvement, consistency is going to be king, right? Even if it's not hard training, being fairly consistent with staying healthy and putting blocks of solid running, and can move your fitness up a couple levels just on its own. Like in this case with this young lady, I mean, if she just was able to run, I would even say 30 miles a week all year, she would probably be in a much better position than she is now, because she basically will train for the marathon and then go and do other things, right? And so, which is fine for general health and things like that, but ultimately if running is what you want to do, then you have to do that running consistently throughout the year. And secondly, with the training segment, does the training match what you are training for? So let's take a typical recreational runner. If they put in 5K, pretty decent 10K, it's probably a little light to have a really good half marathon, and I really couldn't recommend that kind of volume for a marathon. What you'll see a lot of times is an increase in weekly volume from, say, a 5K, 10K runner to a marathoner, but it generally comes from increasing the long runs, right? So that 20 So that 20 might go up to 30, but that extra 10 miles a week is only coming from the one run a week, right? And so that's where the problem, to me, that training doesn't necessarily match what they're training for. It's not enough. So the thing, that increased volume is coming from the long runs. If they're doing a long run of 6 to 8 miles a week for a 5K, and then they jump that up to 18 to 20, you're talking 10 to 14 miles or more a week right there, and then they'll probably do like one bigger workout during the week, be a marathon tempo or something like that, whatever. And, that's where they're getting, another 5 to 10 miles out of the week. Right. And so it's a lot, but as we've talked about several other times, I don't want to go back into that either, but, we know that we've got to be somewhat balanced in our training. And so they might add some marathon pace work that will get them up a little bit further, like I said, but the trade-off is that easy runs will be removed or decreased. So maybe they even run, they're doing enough aerobic easy running miles, a few times a week as their easy runs. That's plenty for a 5K, but if they're staying at 3 miles and just adding in like a marathon workout and a long run, and that's where they're adding 15 to 20 miles, they're not doing enough aerobic development to support what the marathon's going to involve. And honestly, they would be much better off backing down on the long run and even the marathon work and just boosting that base aerobic easy run from 3 to go move that up to 4 or 5 or 6 miles, where it's taking them closer to an hour on those easy runs, they're going to develop that. They have so much more aerobic foundation that they can build. That's going to take them a long way. So it has to, like, the bottom line is that it has to match what they're trying to do. So what we do for a 5K isn't going to match what we can do for a marathon. All right, and then let's see where we're at here. And then you have to take that in mind too with a race equivalency calculator. So if you plug in this young lady, and she was doing these 5Ks that suggested she could run 4:37 in the marathon, but that's also taking into account that she could run that as long as the training matches. Right, so if she's training for the 5K, she can't just use that same 5K training and expect to run a good 4:37 hour marathon. The training then has to extrapolate up with the race distance. So adding on to that point, I think that's where you see a lot of folks in that 4:30 to 5 hour plus range for the marathon. So the pace itself is not overly taxing. A lot of times they're actually running that on their easy runs. A lot of times they're short 30-mile easy runs are faster than what their marathon pace is. The pace itself is not overly taxing, but they tend to slow down more and more and more from miles, say 16 and above. 16, the last 10 miles, each mile probably gets, a little bit worse. And so that by the time you get to 22, 24 plus per mile, every mile that you're going over. And to me, that's simply an indication that the overall endurance is just not there to allow a person to hold on to that pace. And it's something like you can look at. There's a thing called aerobic decoupling. And so what you would look at is you would take a long run, for instance, anything that's over like an hour and a half to 2 hours long. So that's why long runs are usually what people look at. But you can look at it a couple ways. You can look at it from the first miles. I usually take the second mile. The first mile is just kind of warm up, but take what that second mile is and what the last mile is. And what you're looking at is you're seeing if the heart rate versus the decouples, right? So anything more than a 5. So if you took the heart rate divided by the pace, you'd get a ratio, right? And then you would divide, and then you'd look at the ratio of the last mile, and if that's over a 5% difference, then your aerobic to match what you're trying to do. And so that's one thing you can look at. Probably a more involved way, I guess, would be looking at the first half of a run versus the second half of a run. And again, if you see that a 5% decoupling of heart rate versus pace, then you know that your endurance in general, needs to be worked on. And so, but don't take that as I need to do longer long runs. So that means that your easy runs probably are not enough, whether you need to add more during the week, or you just need to add more volume to your easy runs to build that endurance up. And then that will overall help you much more in the marathon if you are in that 4:30 plus range, because now you've got the endurance. So you might not get to 24 before you start slowing down, but instead of being at 16 or 18, huge step on a pretty simple thing to change in your training to gain a lot of time. And then obviously as you get faster, more things would have to change. But if that's something that you haven't done, that's an easy fix that will allow big improvements without a lot of extra work on your end. All right. So to close out, if you're a person looking at a marathon goal time or even a half marathon goal time and you just seemingly fade at the end of a race, or just you're on pace maybe, and then all of a sudden, and it's not going to happen, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The first thing you got to do is look at what your other race distances look like. Do they line up with what you're trying to run? Do those PRs in that line up with what you're trying to run for the longer distance? Second thing, you've got to, if not, work on bringing those down and being more in line with the goal time for the longer event. You don't have to get them to line up perfectly, but you got to be trending in the right direction, right? If those do line up, move to the next thing. So that would be, do I train consistently throughout the year? If not, make that a priority to train consistently throughout the year. If not, make that a priority to train consistently. Now, there doesn't mean you have to train hard, but it means you have to be engaged in some sort of training, whether it's, like as I'm recording this, it's, middle November. A lot of people are in base building segments as winter approaches, and it's, now it's dark by, it's a little bit less likely, but we can still build our base, things like that. And over the summer, we talked about the same thing, like so hot, it's not feasible for some people to be training for a marathon. So that's kind of their base building segment. So it depends on where you're at. But the point is, be in some sort of training throughout the year. So make that a priority. If that does line up, if you are training consistently, then move up to the next thing is, does my training match what it should be for the longer races? If it doesn't, make that a priority. Focus on building the volume in a balanced way, then add the intensity. Give yourself time to adapt to the one training stress at a time. And if you follow a similar path when addressing your true strengths and weaknesses, you'll really shorten the time needed to be in a position to reach that goal. So, I think to wrap it up, I think if you're in a position where you're continually trying to run a certain time and it hasn't happened, and you keep kind of going through the same thing over and over again, look at the 3 things that we're talking about right now. Go through each one, work on that. Then look at training consistently. Am I really training consistently all year, or do I just kind of slack off after that, fall marathon? Like I'll use a friend of mine as an example. So his daughter and my daughter in swim, and we've become friends over the last couple of years, and he's a good golfer over the last couple of years, and he's a good golfer. So he's going to golf in the summer. He's going to golf in the spring. But him and his brother run the Detroit Half Marathon every year, just to he calls it a fitness check, just to see where he's at. I think he just turned 40, and he's like, I just want to see where we're at. He just wants 40, and he's like, I just want to see where we're at. He just wants to compare each year. He just compares to where he was before, and he's like, I thought I'm still a pretty young guy. I could run like 130, and I'm like, Paul, that's pretty quick. I mean, 130 means you're pretty engaged. So I just picture him, because he makes some actually really good points to me. He's like, well, a half marathon is one of those things where if I go out and I put in 20 miles a week, I can finish the half marathon. But he also quickly realized that going out and just running 20 miles a week was not going to let him run a 130, right? And so I think, I like Paul because he has a very good approach to it, and he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He's very aware of where he stands in the running world. But I just think about those things like that. So if you train consistently, yeah, you could definitely knock that down to probably 140. And then also it just doesn't line up with where you should be for say a marathon. We got to fix that, right? And so that would be a good time to use a down time to start kind of building that out, mapping that out. How are you going to get to that point, and then be able to actually reach those goals. So those are just the things I look at when I first bring a person on, and especially when they say, like, I need to be faster to run the time, right? That's the first thing I look at is what their times actually suggest they should run, and then go from there. But those are easy things you can look at, not necessarily so easy to add on, but it gives you a very, very good starting point and something that you can map out yourself, right? Obviously a coach can do that for you as well, but and that's not, that might not be a bad thing where you just, if you want to consult with a coach and you just kind of go over that and just get it like you can establish a baseline on how to get from where I'm at to where I need to be. And so that's one thing that you could work with somebody, because I recognize that coaching itself might be out of the question, not by out of the question, not by want, but more of necessity. So I think you could consult with somebody. That's something we offer. I'm sure other coaches offer that as well. But I think it's good just to have a fresh pair of eyes look at that. And I don't want to think that you just get somebody you trust, at least if you're in a run club, a running group. Have somebody, find somebody you trust to look at it and actually take an objective look at what you're doing, and then brainstorm how you get there. But if that is something you would like us to do, we can obviously do that as well. But I think now is the time, as I'm recording this, like I said, middle November. So I think a lot of people are looking for what to do next and how to get there. And now is the time to be laying those plans before you get to a point where now you got to start training for that marathon or half marathon, and you're in the exact same position you were, 3 or 4 months ago. So, all right, that's what I do. That's what I do. Hopefully that can help you guys out in as you sort things out yourself. And we'll talk to you later. All right, take it easy.